"For heaven's sake, Eliza, don't do this." His voice came out ragged, almost a whisper in the empty drawing room. Lawrence held her arm with a strength born not of anger, but of pure desperation. His eyes, that blue she had learned to decipher, were terrified. "If it's because of what that scoundrel Simon said, He trailed off, unsure what to say. Eliza merely shook her head, her face wet with silent tears she couldn't hold back. "Before we delve into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart." The night at Montverne Manor, nestled somewhere in a secluded valley in rural Virginia, in the already distant year of 1880, smelled of expensive wax and withered hopes. The banquet, which was meant to celebrate the engagement of the youngest daughter, the beautiful Isabella, ended up becoming the stage for Eliza's final humiliation. At 24, she was far from plain. She had hair the color of ripe chestnuts and eyes that seemed to hold all the world's untold stories. But she lacked the vivacity, the mischievous glint in her smile that the men of that society sought. She was too quiet, too observant, and, to the despair of her mother, the matriarch Beatrice Montverne, Eliza made no effort to hide her nature, while Isabella, in her silk gown, imported from France, floated through the drawing room receiving congratulations. Eliza stood by the window, watching the fine rain begin to fall outside. She felt the gazes upon her, the muffled giggles behind the other young ladies' fans. "Poor Eliza," she heard one of them say. "She end up an old maid, for sure." The phrase, sharp as a razor, cut through the air and embedded itself in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd heard something of the sort, but that night it hurt more. It hurt because she saw on her parents' faces not pity, but irritation. She was a problem, a constant reminder of a social failure. Her father, Alfred Montverne, a man who had once been powerful but was now drowning in gambling debts and poor cotton harvests, maintained a hard smile on his face. Every creditor present in the drawing room was a knife at his throat, and Eliza, without an advantageous marriage, was just another burden. Beatrice, her mother, was even crueler in her disappointment. To her, a daughter who didn't marry was a stain on the family's reputation. When the last guest departed, the family's mask of cordiality dropped. The silence that filled the drawing room was heavy, accusatory. Alfred was the first to speak, his grave voice echoing in the room. "I can't take it anymore, Beatrice. I can't take the pitying looks, the whispers. We need to find a way to fix this." Beatrice, adjusting the emerald brooch on her chest, looked at Eliza with a disdain that would freeze hell itself. "This," she repeated, pointing at her daughter. "She's hopeless. No man of good family wanted her. What do you expect me to do? A miracle?" Eliza remained silent, her chin held high. She had learned early on that any answer would be used against her. Crying was a sign of weakness, arguing, of insolence. Silence was her only armor. Not a miracle, but a solution. Alfred walked to his mahogany desk, picked up a letter with a broken seal, and threw it onto the table. "Lawrence Ulmar wrote to me. He needs a governess for that remote estate of his. Someone to bring order to the house, as he lives for the land." Lawrence Ulmar's name fell like a stone in the room. The man's reputation ran wild throughout the region. They said he was a brute. A man whom the pain of his wife's death, years ago, had turned to stone. A wealthy landowner, yes, but isolated and ill-tempered. No one visited him, and he made no effort to be visited. Beatrice's eyes widened. "Are you mad, Alfred? You want to send our daughter to be a servant to a man like that? What a disgrace! And what's the alternative?" he retorted, his voice rising. "Keep her here, like a broken ornament no one wants to buy. At least there she'll have a roof over her head and be useful for something. Lawrence owes me an old favor." He accepted. Eliza felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. To be a governess on an estate owned by a man with such a reputation was an exile, a punishment. It was a public confession that she was good for nothing else. It was to be erased from society, hidden like a shameful secret. "Father, please," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "It's decided." "Eliza." Alfred didn't even look at her. "You leave in 2 days. Pack your things, and don't disgrace me further." That night, in her room, Eliza didn't cry. She packed her few possessions into a wooden trunk, her fingers steady. She took the dresses her mother insisted she wear, a little tight now, as her body had gained curves that the fashion of the time tried to hide. She also packed her books, her only companions. She felt a dull ache, but beneath it, a strange flicker of relief. At least, far from here, she wouldn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She would be free from the balls, the false smiles, the judging glances. The prize of freedom was solitude, but solitude she already knew very well. The journey was long and silent, made in a simple carriage, accompanied only by a coachman who didn't utter a word. The landscape gradually changed, the city mansions giving way to vast fields, to a green that seemed endless. The air grew purer, smelling of wet earth and wild growth. When the gates of Almar Estate finally appeared, Eliza felt a chill. They were tall, made of solid iron, and opened with a creak that sounded like a lament. The manor house was immense, but different from the others she knew. It lacked the ostentation of the region's cotton plantations. It was a solid construction of stone and dark wood, seeming to have risen from the very earth. It had a rustic beauty, but also an aura of abandonment. The garden was unkempt, and the window paint peeling. A grey-haired woman with a stern face received her at the door. Her name was Martha. The governess, who it seemed, was on her way out. "Are you the new mistress?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "I am Eliza. I was hired to help with the house." Martha measured her from head to toe. "The master isn't here. He went to see the cattle. Come, I'll show you your room." The interior of the house was dark and smelled of old wood and fireplace smoke. The furniture was robust, made of oak, but covered by a thin layer of dust. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. The few servants who crossed her path lowered their eyes, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The room assigned to her was not in the family wing, but in a more secluded part of the house, usually used for less important guests. It was simple, with an iron bed, a ceramic basin for washing, and a window that overlooked the corral. From that window, Eliza saw the immensity of the estate stretched to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and purple. The main gate closed with a dry click, and the sound echoed in Eliza's heart. The vastness of the countryside, which had once seemed a promise of freedom, now swallowed her whole. She was alone, exiled. Lawrence Almar only appeared when night had fully fallen. Eliza was in the main parlor, unsure what to do, when the door opened. He was taller than she imagined, broad-shouldered, the type of man shaped by hard labor. His face was rugged, marked by the sun and by life, but what surprised her were his eyes. They were a deep, almost gray blue, a shocking contrast to the harshness of his appearance. A blue that didn't match his reputation for brutality at all. He didn't greet her. His eyes passed over her, as if she were part of the dusty furniture. "Martha," he called, his voice a contained thunder, "take the young lady to her room, and make sure she understands the rules of the house." Martha appeared quickly. "I already have, master." Lawrence merely nodded, took off his dusty hat, and tossed it onto a chair. Without a second glance, he turned and went upstairs, his heavy footsteps making the entire house tremble. Eliza stood still, her heart beating erratically. She felt no fear but a profound emptiness. He hadn't even said her name. To that man she wasn't a person. She was a problem her father had thrust upon him, a burden, a punishment. And there, in the silence of that immense house, under the indifferent gaze of that man with sad eyes, Eliza understood, for the first time, what it meant to be exiled in life. The first days at Alma Estate were an exercise in invisibility. Eliza woke before sunrise, to the distant sound of cattle lowing and roosters crowing. The house was still shrouded in gloom, and she moved in silence, trying not to disturb the established routine of the place. Martha, the former governess, departed on the second day, leaving behind a bunch of keys and a look that mixed pity and warning. "Be careful with the master," was all she said. "He doesn't like noise, or people meddling where they're not called." Eliza soon realized that Martha's words were a euphemism. Lawrence Almar seemed to dislike people, period. He left for the fields before dawn and returned only at dusk, covered in dust and exhaustion. Meals were eaten in silence. He sat at the head of the long dining table, and Eliza at the other end, at a distance that seemed an abyss. He ate quickly, his eyes fixed on his plate, and when he finished, he simply rose and went to his study, where he locked himself away with account books and, judging by the scent escaping through the crack in the door, brandy. The rare times he addressed her, it was to give a short, sharp order. "The pantry needs more flour. Have the leak in my room fixed. Where is my rain jacket?" His voice was always firm, cutting, with no room for pleasantries. Eliza replied with a "Yes, sir," or "Certainly, sir," her voice calm, which seemed to irritate him even more. It was as if he expected a reaction, an argument, a tear, and her serenity disarmed him. The other servants, two younger maids named Leah and Rose, and an older cook, Mrs. Agnes, followed the master's example. They avoided Eliza. They answered her questions with monosyllables and averted their gaze when she approached. In the kitchen, the only place in the house where there was some human warmth, they conversed in whispers, and the conversations ceased abruptly as soon as Eliza entered. She was a stranger, the Baron's daughter who had come, for reasons unknown. They distrusted her, perhaps seeing her as a spy for the decadent gentry, or worse, as someone who would try to take the place of the master's deceased wife, a saint untouchable in the estate's memory. Solitude was her constant companion. In the first weeks, Eliza felt herself sinking into despair. She walked through the empty rooms of the manor house, touching the dust-covered furniture, looking at the portraits on the wall. There was one in particular above the fireplace, of a woman with a sweet smile and bright eyes. Helen Almar, the deceased wife. She was beautiful. Eliza wondered what kind of woman she must have been to leave such a profound mark of absence. But Eliza was not the type to give in. The same resilience that had enabled her to endure her family's disdain now prevented her from drowning in melancholy. If she was there to be a governess, then she would be the best governess that her state had ever had. She started slowly. Instead of giving orders, she began to do. She picked up a cloth and began to clean the dust from the library, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, but which had been abandoned. The books, treasures of leather and paper, were molding. Carefully she cleaned them one by one. In the kitchen, she observed Mrs. Anless's work. The cook was a woman of few words, but with talented hands. Her bread was the best Eliza had ever tasted. Instead of imposing herself, Eliza asked to learn. "Would you mind teaching me how to knead the dough this way?" she asked one day, her voice humble. Agnes looked at her, surprised. No mistress had ever asked to learn something from her. Suspiciously, she taught her, and she saw that Eliza was not afraid to get her hands dirty with flour, that her movements were agile, and that she learned quickly. Slowly a small bridge was built between the two. Eliza began to help in the kitchen, not as a mistress inspecting, but as an apprentice. And with that, the estate's menu began to change. Eliza suggested using the herbs from the almost dead garden to season the meat. "If Master Lawrence doesn't like it, ... Agnes said, fearfully. "Let me take responsibility," Eliza replied. That night, Lawrence ate the stew in silence, as always, but, for the first time, he had a second helping. He said nothing, but Agnes and Eliza exchanged a knowing look in the kitchen. It was a small victory. The vegetable garden was Eliza's next project. It was full of weeds, the soil dry and hard. With the help of one of the older farm hands, Old Man Joe, a man with a sun-wrinkled face and an easy smile, she began to weed. Joe was the first of the field hands to speak to her without reserve. He didn't care that she was the Baron's daughter. He saw only a young woman willing to work. "Aren't you afraid of spoiling those princess hands, ma'am?" he joked, seeing her pull out a stubborn weed. "These hands haven't been a princess's for a long time, Old Man Joe," she replied, smiling, "and they're in need of honest work." Joe laughed, a hearty laugh, and from that day on, he became her ally. He brought her tomato, kale, and basil seedlings. He taught her the secrets of the land. And as they worked, side by side, he told her stories of the estate, of the times when Mistress Helen was alive. "She loved flowers," he said one day, his voice wistful. "The front garden was her pride. After she passed, ... Well, the master never wanted anything to do with flowers again. He pulled everything out." Eliza looked at the front garden. Now a lifeless lawn. She understood a little more of that man's pain. Helen's absence was not just in the portraits. It was in the earth, in the lack of color, in the lack of life. Eliza's days began to take on a new routine. In the morning, she cared for the house. In the afternoon, the garden. In the evening, she read in the library. She had cleaned herself. The warmth of the firewood in the fireplace, the scent of baking bread, and the buzzing of bees in the fields became her companions. She began to sew new curtains for the windows, using old fabrics she found in a trunk. With needle and thread, she mended the melancholy of that house. Lawrence observed everything from afar. He noticed the changes. The house was brighter, cleaner. The smell of mold had been replaced by an aroma of wax and wildflowers, which Eliza insisted on placing in vases. The food was different, more flavorful. The servants seemed ... less tense. He didn't understand. That woman, who should have been a nuisance, an obligation he had accepted because of an old debt to her father, was, silently, putting his house in order. He refused to admit it, but he was intrigued. Who was this Eliza Montverne? She didn't complain, didn't demand, didn't behave like the other women of her class. There was a dignity in her that bothered him, a silent strength he didn't know how to decipher. One evening, he returned from the fields later than usual. A cow was calving, and there had been complications. He was exhausted, covered in mud and blood. Upon entering the house, He expected to find everything dark and silent. But a light came from the kitchen. Curious, he approached without making a sound. Eliza was there, sitting at the table with Leah and Rose, the two younger maids. She was teaching them to read, using her children's storybook. Her voice was low and patient, and the girls, who had once treated her with suspicion, now looked at her with admiration. There were muffled laughs, an atmosphere of complicity he had never seen in that kitchen. He stood in the shadow of the hallway, just watching. He saw Eliza's smile, a genuine smile that lit up her tired face. And for an instant, Lawrence Almar's heart of stone felt something it hadn't felt in years. A pang of warmth. A curiosity that bordered on fascination. He retreated in silence before they saw him and went up to his room. That night, the brandy didn't taste the same. There was something new in the house. Something he hadn't ordered, didn't control, and, to his complete astonishment, didn't want to leave. Weeks turned into months, and Eliza's presence at Alma Estate ceased to be a novelty and became part of the landscape. She was like the gentle rain that, without fanfare, softens dry earth and prepares the soil for life. The manor house no longer had the same air of abandonment. The new curtains, which she herself had sewn, let the sunlight in, revealing the sheen of the polished furniture. Vases with wildflowers, gathered by her on the way from the garden, broke the sobriety of the rooms with splashes of color and fragrance. The vegetable garden, under her care, prospered so much that Mrs. Agnes's kitchen became a parade of fresh vegetables and aromatic herbs. The bounty was so great that Eliza, with Lawrence's tacit permission, he never said yes, but he also never said no, began to distribute the surplus among the farmhands' families. This small gesture, which to her was simply logical, earned her the respect and affection of those simple folk. The tenant farmers' wives began to seek her out, bringing fresh cheese, homemade preserves, or simply coming for a little chat. Leah and Rose, the two girls she taught to read, could now decipher Mrs. Agnes's recipes, and even ventured to read the news in old newspapers that arrived at the estate. Their gratitude turned into loyalty. They no longer saw Eliza as the mistress sent to supervise them, but as a teacher, a friend. The atmosphere in the house changed. Whispers gave way to normal conversations, and now and then, a laugh echoed through the once silent corridors. All this happened under Lawrence's distant yet attentive gaze. He noticed every detail. He noticed how the farmhands' children, who used to run from him, now waved to Eliza when she passed. He noticed the smell of cornbread coming from the kitchen in the afternoon. He noticed that his shirts were always impeccably ironed and mended with an almost invisible stitch. He didn't thank her, didn't praise her. But his silence was no longer so hostile. It was a thoughtful silence. He needed to make a trip to the state capital to arrange the sale of a portion of the cattle herd. It would be a long journey, almost 2 weeks. The idea of leaving the estate for so long worried him. Before, he would leave and return to the same organized chaos as always. Now, there was a new order, an order he had not created, but to which, secretly, he had grown accustomed. "I leave everything under your responsibility," he told Eliza on the morning of his departure. It was the longest sentence he had addressed to her until then. It wasn't a request. It was a statement. "You can go in peace, sir. I will take care of everything." He merely nodded, mounted his horse, and left without looking back. For Eliza, Lawrence's absence was like a breath of fresh air. Not that she feared him, but his presence was like a heavy cloud, always about to burst. Without him, the house seemed to breathe more freely. She used these days to put into practice an idea that had been maturing for some time. Mistress Helen's old sewing room had been locked since her death. Eliza, with Old Man Joe's help, managed to open the jammed door. The room was intact, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment and would soon return. There were rolls of fine fabric, boxes of colored threads, and a German sewing machine. Covered by a white sheet, with care and reverence, Eliza and the girls cleaned everything. Years of dust were removed, and the room came back to life. Eliza, who had learned to sew perfectly in her parents' house, decided to use the materials for a purpose. The clothes of the tenant farmer's children were, for the most part, patched and worn. With the fabrics found, she, Leah, and Rose began to make simple dresses for the girls and new trousers for the boys. The news spread, and soon the manor house veranda was filled with the sound of children's laughter, who came to be measured and choose colors. Meanwhile, Eliza also dedicated herself to the front garden. She remembered what Old Man Joe had said about Helen's love for flowers. With his help, she prepared the soil and planted seedlings of roses, daisies, and lavender, which she obtained from one of the farmhands' wives. It was hard work under the strong sun. But with every sprout that emerged, she felt she was returning a part of that house's soul. She wasn't doing it for Lawrence, nor even for Helen's memory. She was doing it because that place, which was supposed to be her exile, was becoming her home, and she wanted her home to be beautiful. The estate pulsed with a new energy. The workers, seeing the dedication of this woman who had no obligation to care for them, began to work with more diligence. The corral fence was repaired, the barn organized. It was as if Eliza's dedication was contagious. The day of Lawrence's return approached. A certain apprehension filled the house. What would he say when he saw so many changes? What if he was angered by Eliza's boldness in tending the garden, the sanctuary of his memories? Mrs. Agnes advised her to be careful. "The master is a good man, child, but pain has made him bitter. He doesn't like surprises." But it was too late to turn back. The garden was already covered with rosebuds, and the children's clothes had already been delivered. Lawrence's carriage was sighted late in the afternoon. From the parlor window, Eliza watched him dismount. He looked tired from the journey. He stopped for an instant, his gaze fixed on the front garden. His face was an indecipherable mask. He didn't look at the flowers with anger, nor with joy. There was only a profound, almost painful surprise. He entered the house. The smell of wax and warm bread greeted him. The house was impeccably clean and organized. Leah and Rose passed him, curtsied, and, to his astonishment, smiled. He went up to his room and found clean clothes on the bed and hot water for his bath, already prepared. When he came down for dinner, the table was set with the finest china, and a small arrangement of daisies adorned the center. Eliza was already seated in her usual place. The silence during the meal was even denser than usual. Eliza felt her heart pounding. She expected an explosion at any moment, but the explosion didn't come. Lawrence ate, and at the end, he wiped his mouth with the linen napkin. He stared at her, his blue eyes scrutinizing her face. "Who gave the order to tend the garden?" His voice was low, controlled, which was even more frightening. Eliza took a deep breath, preparing herself. "I did, sir." He continued to stare at her, and the sewing room, and the clothes for the children. "I did that too." She met his gaze. Dignity was the only weapon she had. "I used the fabrics that were going to waste. The children needed them. If you are angry, I ask your forgiveness. It will not happen again." Lawrence remained silent for a long moment. The only sound was the pendulum clock on the wall, marking time slowly. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the garden, which was beginning to be bathed in moonlight. The roses, ... he said, his voice almost a murmur, speaking more to himself than to her. They were her favorites. Eliza said nothing. She only observed his broad silhouette against the window. There was a vulnerability in his posture that she had never seen. The man everyone feared seemed, at that moment, merely a terribly lonely man. He turned, and for the first time, there was no harshness in his gaze. There was confusion, perhaps a hint of gratitude, but above all, an overwhelming curiosity. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why are you doing all this?" "Because this house was dying, sir," she replied, with a simplicity that disarmed him. "And I didn't want to die with it." He looked at her once more, a long and deep gaze, as if he were truly seeing her for the first time. Not the Baron's daughter, not the governess, but the woman who, with her own hands, was trying to bring life back to his dead world. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Eliza alone with her heart pounding and the strange feeling that something fundamental had just changed between them. The storm she expected did not come, but the sky over Almar Estate was definitely no longer the same. After that night, the dynamic between Lawrence and Eliza changed, though almost imperceptibly to others. The curt orders gave way to questions. "What will we have for dinner?" he would ask, instead of simply waiting for the food. "Do we need anything from town?" he would inquire before sending a farmhand there. They were small things, but for Eliza, they meant the world. They meant he was acknowledging her not just as an employee, but as the administrator of his home. He began to observe her more openly. In the morning, when he left for the fields, he sometimes found her in the garden, her simple dress soiled with earth, her face flushed from exertion. He didn't stop, didn't say anything, but his gaze lingered on her for an extra second. He saw the firmness in her gestures, the way she dealt with the workers, with respect, but without subservience. There was a natural authority in her that came not from noble birth, but from competence. His curiosity, which had once been an annoyance, now became a driving force. Who was this woman who preferred the company of books and plants to that of drawing rooms, who seemed more at ease with her hands in the soil than holding a fan? He had accepted Alfred Montvern's proposal out of pity and an old debt of honor. He expected a spoiled socialite, full of laments. He received, in return, a silent and strong woman who was transforming his estate, and to his disquiet, his thoughts. Eliza, in turn, also observed him. She saw the weariness in his broad shoulder when he returned from work. She saw the way his large, rough hands, so firm for holding a horse's reins, stroked the animal's mane with an unexpected gentleness. She perceived that, behind the facade of a brute, there was a wounded man, a man who used incessant work as an escape from his own memories. Autumn arrived, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and a cold wind that swept across the fields. Afternoons grew shorter, and nights longer. With the rainy season came the storms. They were violent in the region, with lightning that cut across the sky and thunder that made the manor house windows tremble. On one of those afternoons, the sky suddenly darkened. A dreadful storm formed on the horizon, advancing over the estate with terrifying fury. Lawrence was in the furthest pasture, trying to gather a new herd that was not yet accustomed to the terrain. Eliza, from the kitchen window, watched the sky with apprehension. The farmhands ran to close the corrals and shelter the animals. The rain poured down all at once, a deluge that turned the earth into mud. The wind howled, and lightning illuminated the scene with ghostly flashes. Minutes passed, and Lawrence did not return. Eliza's concern began to turn into fear. She knew his horse, a magnificent sorrel named Gale, was skittish and startled by thunder. Suddenly, a louder thunderclap exploded. seeming to split the sky in two. Seconds later, they heard a desperate whinny coming from the direction of the barn. Old Man Joe, the foreman, ran into the kitchen, his face pale. "It's the master." The horse got scared by the lightning, reared up and threw him. "Now the beast is out of control, won't let anyone near." Without a second thought, Eliza tore off her apron and ran out towards the barn. The rain drenched her in seconds, her hair clinging to her face, her dress heavy on her body. The scene she found was pure chaos. Gale, the horse, was rearing, his eyes wide with terror, his front hooves striking the air. Lawrence was on the ground, near the animal, trying to get up, his leg at an odd angle. He was clearly injured. The other farmhands kept a safe distance, afraid of being kicked. "Stay back, he'll kill someone," Lawrence shouted, his voice muffled by pain and rain. But Eliza didn't listen. She saw only the injured man and the panicked animal. Instead of approaching from the front, she circled around, moving slowly, her voice calm. "Calm down, my beauty, ... she whispered, her voice soft, almost a song. The horse noticed her, turned its head in her direction, ears perked, ready to attack. But she didn't recoil. She continued to speak to him, her voice firm and reassuring. She remembered how her grandfather, a great horse breeder, had taught her to deal with frightened animals. "Never show fear," he would say. "They smell fear." She extended her hand slowly, without abrupt movements. Gale whinnied, but did not attack. He seemed mesmerized by her calm. Eliza moved closer until she could touch the animal's neck. Its skin trembled beneath her fingers. She began to stroke its wet mane, always whispering words of comfort. "There, it's over, ... It's past, ... You're a good boy, ... Gradually, the horse calmed down. Its panting subsided, and it stopped moving. With a firmness no one imagined she possessed, Eliza took the reins. "Now move away from him, slowly," she told the farmhands, who stared at her, astonished. She then led the horse into the barn, secured him, and ran back to help Lawrence. He was sitting in the mud, his face contorted in pain. "My leg, I think it's broken." Old Man Joe and another farmhand helped him up and carried him into the house. Eliza went ahead, clearing the way, already giving orders. "Leah, prepare the master's bed. Rose, hot water and clean cloths. Agnes, a strong herbal tea for the pain." They laid him on the bed. Eliza, soaked and shivering with cold, didn't care. Carefully she cut his trousers to examine his leg. It was swollen and bruised, but it seemed to be a bad sprain, not a fracture. She had seen worse injuries among the estate workers. With steady hands, she cleaned the wound and applied a compress with herbs she had learned to use from Mrs. Agnes. Lawrence watched her in silence, the sweat of pain mixed with rainwater on his face. He saw her work with impressive competence, her calm voice giving precise orders, her delicate hands moving with dexterity. He saw the gleam in her eyes. It wasn't fear nor hesitation. It was courage. The same courage she used to calm a 500-pound beast in a panic. When everything was done, and he was medicated and his leg bandaged, the others left the room, leaving the two of them alone. The storm outside was beginning to subside. The only sound was the rain beating against the window and the crackling of the fire in the fireplace, which Leah had lit. Eliza stood by the bed, still drenched. Her simple dress clung to her body, and only then did she seem to realize her state. She hugged herself, shivering with cold. Lawrence tried to sit up. "You don't exert yourself, sir. Rest." He stared at her, and for the first time the admiration in his eyes was unmistakable. The man who looked down on everyone, the feared master, was looking at her with a kind of awe. "You saved my life, and my horse's. I only did what needed to be done, she said simply. He tried to thank her, to say something, but his voice failed. The words seemed too small for what he felt. The silence between them lingered, but it was not an awkward silence. It was a silence laden with new meanings. That stormy afternoon, something broke. It wasn't Lawrence's leg, but the wall of ice he had built around himself. He saw, in the soaked woman before him, not a governess, but an equal, a force of nature, as untamed as the storm outside. And that discovery left him more shaken than his fall from the horse. In the days that followed, the routine of Almar Estate was forcibly altered. With his leg immobilized, Lawrence found himself a prisoner within the manor house, a torture for a man accustomed to the freedom of the fields. His frustration was palpable. He became impatient, irritable, taking out his helplessness on anyone nearby. The maids walked on tiptoes, and even old man Joe, the foreman, avoided the master's room. The only person who seemed immune to his bad temper was Eliza. She cared for him with a patience and firmness that disarmed him. She brought his meals, changed his dressings, and administered Mrs. Agnes's bitter teas without being fazed by his grumbling. "You don't need to stay here watching me as if I were a child," he grumbled one morning as she adjusted his pillows. "I'm not watching, sir. I'm making sure your leg heals quickly, so you can go back to tormenting us all outside," she replied, her voice serene, but with a hint of irony that caught him by surprise. He stared at her, ready to give a sharp retort, but ended up letting out a sound that was almost a laugh. It had been so long since he had laughed that the sound came out rusty. Eliza smiled discreetly and continued her work. That small moment of lightness opened a crack in his armor. Forced into inactivity, Lawrence began to talk. At first, they were just questions about the estate. How are the new cattle? Has the south pasture fence been repaired? Eliza, who kept herself informed about everything with old man Joe, answered with precision, showing a knowledge of the property's management that impressed him. He realized that, while he dedicated himself to the brute labor, she had, silently, learned to manage the estate from within. Gradually, the conversations became more personal. He began to ask about her life before coming there. "What was it like at your home?" he asked one rainy afternoon as she read a book sitting in an armchair near his room window to keep him company. Eliza hesitated. Talking about her past was stirring up old wounds, but his gaze was not one of simple curiosity. It was one of genuine interest. It was ... different, she began, choosing her words carefully. "There were many balls, many dinners. My mother worried a great deal about appearances, my father about business. And my sister ... Well, my sister was the center of attention." "And you?" he insisted, his voice soft. "Me? I stayed in the corners with my books. I never fit into that world. I was too quiet, too honest. My mother used to say I lacked charm." She said the last word with a sad smile. And Lawrence felt a pang of anger at that family who had failed to see the gem they had in their hands. He, who had also never fit into drawing rooms, who had always preferred the brutal honesty of the countryside to the falsity of the city, understood her perfectly. "Charm is for those who have nothing else to offer," he said, with a conviction that surprised her. Those conversations became a ritual. She told him about the books she read, and he, to her astonishment, revealed himself to be a voracious reader. The library which she had saved from abandonment was his refuge too. They discussed history, agriculture, poetry. They discovered affinities they could never have imagined. He, in turn, began to talk about himself. He spoke of his childhood on the estate, of how he learned to love that land with his father. He spoke of work, of the satisfaction of seeing the cattle fatten, of the joy of a bountiful harvest. But he'd never mentioned Helen's name. His deceased wife was a ghost that hovered between them, a locked door in the middle of a corridor that both were afraid to try to open. The forced proximity was doing something to them. Eliza no longer saw the brutal and frightening man, but an intelligent, dedicated, and profoundly lonely man. And he no longer saw the rejected daughter of a baron, but a woman of a strength and wisdom that captivated him. The admiration he had felt on the day of the storm was, little by little, turning into something warmer, more dangerous. He found himself observing her, the way the sunlight caught her hair when she leaned to arrange the firewood in the fireplace, the concentration on her face when she read, the soft sound of her voice, and he felt guilty for feeling that, for another woman, in the same room where his beloved Helen had fallen ill and died. Eliza also felt the change. She felt the warmth of his gaze upon her. She felt her own heart race when their hands brushed accidentally as she handed him a cup of tea. She, who had never felt desired, who considered herself invisible to men's eyes, was being seen. And it was frightening and wonderful at the same time. Lawrence's leg was improving. Soon he could walk around the room with the aid of a crutch. The physical improvement, however, seemed to bring back a certain emotional distance. It was as if, in regaining his independence, he also felt the need to rebuild his walls. The fear of that new vulnerability haunted him. One afternoon, Eliza was tidying his study, a room he kept locked and only allowed her to enter for cleaning after much insistence. The place was impregnated with his scent, leather, tobacco, and earth. As she dusted an old desk, her finger brushed against a small button hidden in the wood. Curious, she pressed it. A secret drawer opened, revealing a small compartment. Inside, there was only a bundle of letters, tied with a faded satin ribbon, and a small miniature portrait of Helen. Eliza's heart pounded. She felt she was invading a sacred place. She was about to close the drawer when her eyes were drawn to the handwriting on the first letter. It was delicate, feminine. They were Helen's letters. A terrible guilt flooded her, but an even greater curiosity consumed her. She needed to understand. She needed to understand the woman who still held so much power over that man's heart. With trembling hands, she took the first letter from the bundle. She didn't open it. She just held it, feeling the weight of those unread words. At that exact moment, she heard the sound of Lawrence's crutch in the hallway. He was coming to the study. In a panic, Eliza quickly closed the secret drawer and moved away from the desk, her heart hammering in her chest. The letter, however, she hid in her apron pocket, on an impulse she couldn't explain. Lawrence entered the room, his face serious. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. "Just cleaning, sir, as you asked." His gaze swept the study, suspicious, and stopped at the desk. For a second, Eliza thought he had discovered it. But he merely sighed, weariness returning to weigh on his shoulders. "Leave it. You may go. I want to be alone." Eliza left the study, her legs trembling. In her room she took the letter from her pocket. The envelope was yellowed with age. Lawrence's name was written on the front. The temptation to read was immense. It was wrong, she knew. It was a violation of the trust that, with great difficulty, she was building with him. But it was also, perhaps, the only way to understand the darkness that inhabited him. The only way to know if what was beginning to blossom between them had any chance of surviving in the shadow of the perfect woman who had come before her. Night fell, and Eliza remained seated on her bed, the letter in her hand, the wax seal intact. The dilemma consumed her. read and perhaps destroy everything. Or not read and live forever in doubt, loving a man whose heart might never truly be hers. The candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall, as inconstant as the feelings in her chest. And in the silence of her room, she made a decision. Curiosity, that itch in her soul, spoke louder than prudence. With trembling fingers, Eliza broke the wax seal, which crumbled like red dust onto her lap. The letter's paper was thin, almost transparent, and the words, written in elegant handwriting, seemed to float on the page. The letter was undated, but from the fragility of the paper, it was old. "My dearest Lawrence," it began, "I write this letter from our room as I watch you, through the window, ride towards the cotton fields. You look so strong, so much the master of the world, mounted on your gale. Little do you know the storm brewing within me. Solitude, my love, is a silent illness. This house, which was once our nest, has become my gilded cage. The days are long, the nights even longer. I miss you even when you are here, lost in your business, in your worries about the land. The land, sometimes I feel you love it more than me." Eliza stopped reading, her heart aching. These were not the words of a happy, loved woman. They were the lament of a lonely soul. She continued reading. "The town doctor came to see me today. He says it's just melancholy, a woman's ailment. He prescribed rest and country air." What an irony. The country air is what suffocates me. I feel weak, Lawrence, a weariness that does not pass. I wanted to tell you. I wanted you to sit beside me and just hold my hand. But you are always so busy, so distant. Your silence is the highest wall I've ever known, and I no longer have the strength to climb it. I love you, my husband, but I fear my love is not enough to save me. Forgive me for my weakness. Yours forever, Helen. Eliza folded the letter, her hands cold. The revelation hit her like a punch to the stomach. That woman, the saint, the perfect wife, had not died of a sudden illness. She had died of sadness, of abandonment, and Lawrence... He was not just a grieving widower. He was a man consumed by guilt. His silence, his obsessive dedication to work, his armor of brutality... It all made sense now. It was his penance. He blamed himself for Helen's death. A wave of compassion for that tormented man washed over her, so strong it almost took her breath away. That new feeling she harbored for him, which before was a mixture of fear and fascination, now deepened, taking on contours of tenderness and an immense desire to heal him. The next day, the way Eliza treated Lawrence changed. Professional patience gave way to genuine, affectionate care. She no longer saw him as the master, but as a wounded man who needed help. She began to encourage him to leave his room, to take some sun on the veranda. She read to him, no longer out of obligation, but for pleasure, choosing passages from books that spoke of new beginnings and forgiveness. He, at first, resisted. He was accustomed to his solitude, to his cocoon of pain. But Eliza's persistent kindness began to pierce his defenses. She didn't treat him with pity, which he would have hated. She treated him with a silent understanding, as if she could see through him, straight into his guilty soul. "You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders all the time," she said one day, as she helped him walk along the veranda. "The estate depends on me," he replied. The usual excuse. "The estate will survive if you take an afternoon to do nothing but listen to the birds sing. The world won't end." He looked at her, and in that look, she saw the confirmation of everything she had read in the letter. She saw the weariness of years of self-punishment. While their relationship deepened in that forced intimacy outside the room, life on the estate continued, and not everyone viewed that closeness with good grace. The foreman, Simon, a middle-aged man, loyal to Lawrence in a possessive way, observed everything with growing jealousy. Simon had been on the estate since before Lawrence's marriage to Helen. He idolized the memory of the former mistress and saw Eliza as a usurper. Simon was a man of little education, but of dangerous cunning. He saw Eliza's influence grow not only over the master, but over the other servants. He saw how she was respected, how her opinion was taken into account. He felt his own power diminishing. To him, Eliza was a threat, a city smarty-pants who had come to turn their world upside down. He began to sow seeds of discord. To the farmhands in the corral, he said Eliza was taking advantage of the master's illness to take charge of everything. "She's got greedy eyes," he whispered. "Soon she'll be running everything, and the master, blinded by her charms, won't even notice." To the women in the tenant settlement, he insinuated that Eliza's kindness was pretense. "Don't be fooled by that saintly face. City women are all the same. They use tricks to get what they want. She's trying to marry for money, that's what." The gossip, like weeds, began to spread. The distrust, which Eliza had taken months to dissipate, once again hung in the air. Some servants, influenced by Simon, returned to treating her with coldness. Eliza noticed the change, but couldn't understand its origin. She was so focused on caring for Lawrence that it took her a while to perceive the web Simon was weaving around her. The breaking point was a small argument Eliza had with Simon about the cattle's feed. She had read in one of Lawrence's books about a new forage mixture that could increase milk production. She suggested that change to Simon, who rejected it with contempt. "We've always done it this way, and it's always worked. It won't be a little woman who doesn't even know the difference between a bull and a cow who's going to teach me my job." "I'm not teaching, Simon. I'm suggesting. The book says that... Keep your books to yourself, ma'am." He cut her off, his voice loud in front of other farmhands. "Your place is in the kitchen, not in my corral." The humiliation was public. Eliza, her face burning, turned her back and returned to the manor house, her eyes full of tears. That night, Simon, feeling he needed a final blow to undermine Eliza's position, went to the study where Lawrence, already feeling better, was reviewing some accounts. With a false expression of concern, he began his attack. "Master, I apologize for bothering you, but I'm worried." "Speak, Simon. What is it?" "It's that Miss Eliza. People are talking. They say she's been very meddlesome, giving orders that aren't her concern, meddling in everything. And there's more. They say she's been casting spells, some witchcraft, to keep you so docile under her thumb, using those herbal concoctions she makes. Lawrence, who was beginning to free himself from his own demons, was caught by surprise. The mention of spells was ridiculous, but the seed of doubt was planted. Insecurity, his old companion, returned to haunt him. What if Simon was right? What if Eliza's kindness was just a game of manipulation? The guilt he felt over Helen mingled with the fear of being deceived again, of being vulnerable. The memory of his wife's loneliness, which he hadn't noticed in time, haunted him. Was he, once again, being blind? "What exactly do you mean by that, Simon?" Lawrence asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm just telling you to be careful, Master. Mistress Helen was a saint. This one, no one knows where she came from, or what she truly wants." Simon's words, venomous and calculated, hit their target. The wall that Eliza had taken weeks to begin to tear down, Lawrence rebuilt in a matter of minutes, higher and stronger than ever. Doubt, once installed in the heart of a wounded man, is a plague difficult to eradicate. The next day, Elise felt the cold even before entering Lawrence's room. It was a cold that didn't come from the damp morning, but from him. He stood by the window, already dressed for the day, without her help. The crutch leaned against the wall. He supported himself with a cane, his posture rigid, his face closed like a vault door. "Good morning, sir. I see you're feeling better," she said, trying to keep her voice light, as she placed the breakfast tray on a small table. He didn't reply. He merely turned and stared at her, his blue eyes transformed into two shards of ice. The warmth, the complicity they had built, everything had vanished. "As of today, I no longer require your care," he said, the word care spoken with a contempt that physically wounded her. "Leia and Rose can attend to what's needed. Return to your original duties, and keep to them." Eliza stood paralyzed, the coffee cup in her hand. The shock was so great she almost dropped it. "But has something happened? Are you not feeling well?" "I am perfectly fine. And I will be even better when everyone in this house remembers their place. Yours is to manage the servants, not the estate. And certainly not my life. Was I clear?" The words were like whips. The coldness was the same she had encountered on the first day, but now it hurt 1,000 times more, because she had tasted warmth. She had glimpsed the man behind the mask, and had grown fond of him. "Yes, sir." "Perfectly clear," she managed to say, her voice a mere thread. She withdrew from the room, feeling his gaze burning into her back. She walked through the manor house corridors, which suddenly seemed vast and hostile again. The sandcastle she had built with such care had been swept away by a wave of fury she did not comprehend. Throughout the day he avoided her. He spent most of his time locked in the study with Simon. Eliza heard them talking, Lawrence's voice low and grave, Simon's falsely solicitous. The poison was taking effect. At dinner, the silence at the table was torture. He didn't look at her, eating with a furious haste. Eliza felt a knot in her throat. The food wouldn't go down. What had she done so wrong? The uncertainty was worse than any accusation. That night in her room, the pain finally overcame her. The tears she had held back all day came with force, silent and bitter. She cried for the injustice, for the sudden coldness, for the hope that had been stolen from her. She cried for feeling, once again, rejected and misunderstood. The candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall, and Solitude, her old acquaintance, returned to keep her company, crueler than ever. She remembered Helen's letter. "Your silence is the highest wall I have ever known." Now, she perfectly understood what Helen had felt. Lawrence didn't argue, didn't explain. He simply shut himself off, locked himself in his own pain and guilt, and left others outside in the cold. The days that followed were the worst since she had arrived at the estate. Lawrence treated her with a glacial politeness, a calculated distance that was more painful than a shout. He revoked some of the changes she had implemented merely to reassert his authority. He forbade the reading lessons in the kitchen, saying the maids were paid to work, not to study. He dismantled the small medicinal herb garden she had created, claiming he didn't want any quackery in his house. Each act was a dagger thrust, a way to diminish her, to put her back in her place. The other servants, seeing the treatment the master meted out to her, distanced themselves even further. Simon walked around the estate with an air of triumph, his chest puffed out. He had won. Eliza endured everything in silence. The same dignity that had sustained her in her parents' home was what kept her standing now. She performed her duties with robotic efficiency, her face a mask of neutrality, but inside she was breaking. The joy she had found in transforming that place was dying. The estate, which had become her home, was once again her prison. One afternoon she was in the garden, the only place he hadn't dared to destroy. She was tending Helen's roses, pulling off dry leaves, when she heard him approach. He stopped a few paces from her, his cane plunged into the earth. "I see you still waste your time with this," he said, his voice cutting. Eliza didn't turn round. She continued her work. "Tending to beauty is never a waste of time, sir. It's what keeps us from becoming as dry as the leaves we pluck." The answer struck him. He expected submission, perhaps tears. He received a philosophy lesson disguised as gardening. "Don't come at me with your flowery phrases, Eliza. I am not one of your books." "No, you are not," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were red but dry. "A book, when one doesn't understand it, one can read again. You ... You shut yourself off and throw away the key." His face contorted. The truth in those words was undeniable. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice softer, almost an appeal. "Me? Nothing. I just wanted to understand. I wanted to understand why the man who shared his thoughts with me for weeks suddenly treats me as a stranger. Or worse, as an enemy. Perhaps I realized I was speaking too much, trusting too much. Or perhaps you prefer to listen to the lies of those who fear change, instead of believing the truth of someone who only wished you well." The confrontation was open. Eliza's pain had transformed into a desperate courage. She had nothing left to lose. "You know nothing about me, about my life, about what I lost in this house," he exploded, the pain finally overflowing. "I know more than you imagine," she retorted, her voice rising. "I know that you hide behind this estate, this work, this anger, because you cannot forgive yourself. You don't live, Mr. Lawrence, you serve a sentence. And your greatest crime is to condemn everyone around you to live in the same prison as you." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of the wind in the trees dared to interrupt. Eliza's words hung in the air, raw, terrible, and undeniably true. Lawrence looked at her as if he had never seen her before. The quiet, submissive woman had disappeared, giving way to a wounded lioness. He took a step back, as if he had been physically struck. Unable to utter a word, he turned and limped away, as fast as his cane allowed. Eliza remained alone in the garden, her heart beating wildly. She knew she had gone too far. She had exposed his deepest wound. Now there was no turning back. The thin thread that bound them had finally snapped, and amidst Helen's roses, she understood that she could no longer stay. She could not live beside a man who refused to be saved. That night, the decision was made. She would leave. The decision to leave brought Eliza a resigned peace. In the quiet of the night, she packed her small trunk, putting away her few belongings and the dignity she had left. On the oak dining table, she left a short, formal letter, written with the steady hand of one who had no more tears to cry. "Thank you for the opportunity. I depart at dawn." Before the first rays of sun touched the sky, she walked toward the gate, her self-imposed exile. Lawrence also didn't sleep. Eliza's words in the garden echoed in his mind, stripping bare the truth of his cowardice. He realized the terrible mistake of listening to Simon's venom and pushing away the only person who had tried to save him from himself. Remorse consumed him. Upon descending, the letter on the table was like a death sentence. Panic overwhelmed him as he read the cold words, and through the window saw her silhouette receding into the morning mist. Forgetting the pain in his leg, he ran outside, shouting her name in desperation. He reached her near the gate, breathless, his face transfigured by urgency. "For heaven's sake, Eliza, don't do this," he pleaded, holding her arm with a force that was pure fear of losing her. The desperation in his blue eyes was the confession that words could not form. "If it's because of what I said, because of what I did, please, don't leave me." The plea for forgiveness was there, silent, raw, and true. Seeing the vulnerability of the man who was rebuilding himself before her, Eliza felt her heart yield. She knew that, despite all the pain, she couldn't leave. Eliza's return to the manor house, supported by Lawrence, was a silent declaration to everyone on the estate. That same day, Simon was dismissed from his duties, and harmony, little by little, returned to reign. Between Lawrence and Eliza, a new relationship of respect and partnership blossomed. He treated her as an equal in the administration of the business, and her opinion became fundamental. However, a barrier of caution still separated them, a safe space for both to heal their wounds. This new peace was interrupted months later by the arrival of a carriage, the Montverne family. They came with the excuse of rescuing their daughter, but their intention was clear. "We've come to take her home," her father Alfred announced with a false smile. "Your punishment is over. It's time to return and make an advantageous marriage to clear the family name." Before Eliza could reply, Lawrence stood in front of her. "Protect her. Eliza is not here as punishment," he said, his voice firm as a rock. "This house was a tomb before she arrived. She is not a burden. She's the woman who brought meaning back to my life. Her place is wherever she wishes to be." All eyes turned to Eliza. On one side, the past of rejection. On the other, a future of acceptance and love. The choice was hers, for the first time in her life. "My place is here," she declared, her voice unwavering. Sealing her destiny. Defeated, the family departed, leaving behind only the dust of the road. Alone on the veranda, under the afternoon sun, Lawrence extended his hand to Eliza. She took it. In that touch, without any words needing to be said, a new future, built on truth and forgiveness, finally began for the two of them. With the chains of the past broken, Eliza and Lawrence's transformation mirrored that of the estate itself, which flourished with their new harmony. She accepted herself, no longer as the rejected one, but as a complete woman. He, in turn, learned to smile, allowing guilt to become a scar, not a chain. Their love was a silent pact, built on daily gestures and knowing glances, stronger than any verbal promise. Peace with the past was sealed one night when Eliza found Helen's portrait. Lawrence, seeing her, confessed his pain. "I didn't know how to make her happy. When I realized, it was too late." His voice was that of a man who finally forgave himself. Eliza touched his face. "The man standing before me has learned from pain." The kiss they shared there healed the last wound, uniting respect for the past with the promise of the future. Months later, on a rainy night, Lawrence led her to the center of the drawing room. Without a word, he embraced her, and in that silence, everything was said. Their love needed no declarations. It was a refuge. There, the woman who had been rejected and the man who had been feared found definitive peace, proving that true beauty is born from the courage of two souls who, together, become whole. So, did you enjoy the conclusion of Eliza and Lawrence's story? This journey of overcoming and love shows us that true strength comes from within, and that even the hardest hearts can learn to love again. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Hit the like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and most importantly, Leave a comment below telling us what you liked most about this romance. Your opinion is our greatest encouragement. Warm regards and see you next time.